Whether by design or intent, or just happy coincidence, or a combination of all the above, marriage emerged in the past as a force for stabilization, one could say. And I speak of stabilization in contrast to the alternative, which would be polygamy. The idea here being that marriage, that is, monogamous marriage, allegedly monogamous marriage, one man, one woman, etc., was a better setup for civilization, society, than was every man for himself, where only the top dog got not just a female, but a harem of females, or many females, and many, many men were left out. And I also say this for the obvious reason that based on the evidence you can observe in the world, across the globe, polygamous societies don't do nearly as well as monogamous societies, which is to say societies without the routine of alleged monogamous marriage typically don't build great and big things. They're tribal, hunter-gatherers, etc. That's just the way it is. And I think we need to point that out if we're going to steelman any aspect of marriage. It's kind of obvious. The tribesmen of the Amazon, the hunter-gatherers found in the Kalahari, they're not building skyscrapers, they're not achieving a whole lot, and part of that has to do with the fact that they have primitive mating structures that don't work towards grander civilizational projects. Okay, so far so good. So if marriage had this role, what has happened? Now today, gentlemen, the topic will be the rise and decline of marriage, specifically in the States, and link to the article in the low bar. But in the United States, at least, marriage records have plummeted to an all-time low. Not just the lowest in years, not just the lowest in decades, the lowest since about the 1860s. And there are a lot of potential reasons for this. The article in question cites financial reasons and worries about financial security, which speaks to a point that I've made in the past, repeatedly, constantly, if you will, namely that marriage is about the bucks. Marriage is about the financial aspects that allow you to create security for the woman or the female that then allow you to have children and raise a family. That's the primary aspect of it. The claim being made here is that more and more people are cohabitating as an alternative. Alternative to what? To marriage. Marriage being expensive. Now, when people speak of marriage being expensive, we all know to read in between the lines. What does that really mean? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Marriage is expensive because she wants a bloody expensive wedding. A wedding that could cost tens and tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars. Her special day, as it were. And the reality here is that millennials in particular are strapped for cash, and the men can't afford it. And a lot of the people involved don't have the option to have these big, fancy, exorbitantly expensive weddings, which are only good for one day anyway, her day. So they're cohabitating. And if you look at the data across the board, there are differences between male-female cohabitation and traditional marriage. It's not as if they're one-to-one, identical, the same thing, especially in terms of outcomes. So, for example, they do seem to suggest, the data, that children do better in married households as opposed to just cohabitating households. Again, you got to steelman what's good about marriage. It's good for raising children. Still is, ideally, when the marriage functions. That's an important point to highlight here. But one element we rarely talk about in the manosphere, and I think it's important to address this, is that marriage historically, for the longest period of time, at least since the inception of Christianity and Christianity's cultural and political stranglehold on the West, marriage has been a quote-unquote sacred institution. One got married under the auspices of God, it was claimed. And people don't talk about this frequently, but in addition, or rather accompanying the phenomenon of massive declines in marriage overall, the rates of marriage, there has been a massive decline in authentic, sincere religiosity. Because here's the thing. For you to realize that marriage is just about the bucks and marriage is just about the financial aspects of maintaining a household with enough money and resources such that you can raise children, that is the man doing that, clearly, because the woman, although she contributes sometimes, men are still the majority contributors in this fashion. Well, to not see marriage as anything but that, even if you're superficially offering up silly romantic tones of, oh, marriage is about love, and marriage is about commitment, and marriage is about this, you can't really be a believer. You see, the only people these days who still believe in the sacred nature of marriage are probably Roman Catholics. After all, it was Henry VIII in the 16th century who decided to part from the Catholic Church in an effort to further his divorce plans, as he wasn't particularly satisfied with his arrangements with the women he had gotten involved with. So basically, Roman Catholics still regard marriage as a holy or sacred institution. Divorce is, within the confines of the Roman Catholic Church, functionally illegal, although not in practice. And everyone else just doesn't really believe that marriage is very much of a sacred cow anymore. And if you don't believe that marriage is magic, basically, or the symbolism behind marriage is magic, well, what exactly are you going to think about marriage? What are you going to attribute to marriage? It's going to be just another thing you do. And for the longest periods of time, many irreligious people who did not believe one thing or another got married for reasons of routine and monkey see, monkey do. That's just what you did because everyone did it before you and you just rinsed and repeated, of course. Well, the times seem to be changing in this regard. And the thing to pay attention to here is the very, very salient point, probably more salient than all the other stuff, including the religious aspects or lack thereof. Marriage is no longer sacred. Financial aspects. People can't afford marriage, at least her special day style marriages. And more broadly, marriage as an institution is expensive. Never mind the divorce stuff. We can talk about that in a bit. And the most salient point is that marriage prospects just don't exist for the vast majority of people, specifically men. The article doesn't talk about this, but I will. Most men, younger men, don't have these prospects. They don't, quote-unquote, earn enough money. They're probably not, quote-unquote, attractive enough, whatever. So the options don't exist. Now, you'll never get somebody to say that in the mainstream. They might report a decline in marriage, grant you that, but they're not going to talk about that aspect of things. And this has a lot to do with the shift in the mean. Shift in the mean of appearance, in terms of attractiveness, shift in the mean of financial resources, etc., etc. Things have been moving to the right of the bell curve in this regard. Things are different than they used to be. And I have a forthcoming video in which I will talk a lot more about that specific aspect. But today I want to focus mostly on marriage. So really we have a triple whammy here. People can't really afford it anymore. Men specifically can't afford it anymore. People in general don't believe in the magic qualities of marriage, which is to say they're not religious. They don't think a deity has infused marriage with some sacred, holy bond that exists unto eternity. And the opportunities are few and far between. Sure, some people are cohabitating, but these mainstream articles never make mention of the people who will never cohabitate. And this is all coming together to create a completely new landscape for marriage and relationships. One thing I want to mention now that I will mention in the forthcoming video is the simple fact that our environment, our sexual mating market environment, is changing more rapidly than anyone could conceive of. The current year, 2020, is vastly different from 2013, and that was just 7 years ago, I should remind you. And going forward, it'll be very, very difficult to make predictions. Again, I'm just going to briefly touch upon this because there'll be a lot more to say about this in a forthcoming video. But this decline, or rather this absolute plummet to the bottom, rock bottom, low levels of marriage ever in the history of the United States, this is a reflection of more than just the current pestilence or crisis. This is a reflection of more than just finances. There are other things going on. And so I thought it was important to highlight this here. One, sincere religiosity isn't there anymore, and to the extent that it is, it has very little to do with marriage. Most people don't believe marriage is a holy institution, and the fact that millennials, and specifically Zoomers, it is a whole new can of worms when it comes to the mating market for these guys, and most mainstream people are not going to take that into account. And before I close up shop here, let us address the very obvious fact that marriage is a very, very risky endeavor indeed, with divorce rates being pretty consistent across the board, and globally divorce rates being bolstered by women's impulses and inclinations, as globally women initiate divorce 70% of the time. I mentioned this because at the beginning I said marriage acted as a stabilizing force, and it still could in theory, but how many marriages these days are stable? And how many marriages are quote-unquote good for children when parents are screaming at each other left and right, day in and day out? And in the worst case scenario, a worst case scenario that happens pretty frequently if we're honest, there's divorce, which can be very, very damaging to children. So you have not just a triple whammy, but a quadruple whammy in a lot of ways. And all these factors come together to explain why marriage is just on the way out. It is very unlikely that we're going to see a rise to anything that we regard as historical normativity in this regard. And you might see some peaks again, but I think overall the trend is going to be dip, 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 dip to the bottom. Marriage is, for all the reasons I've cited, financial reasons, lack of religious conviction, inaccessibility, inability to even find somebody to get married to, and the very, very, very real risks associated with marriage, that is losing your entire livelihood and your life. Well, let's be honest. These are all the contributing factors that in time are going to all but put marriage as an institution in the grave. Anyway, gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. I hope you are doing reasonably well in these trying times. And as always, may the gods watch over you. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out rather soon. Take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.